My name is Evelyn Sears. I was 34 years old. The night my father stood beneath crystal chandeliers, raised a champagne glass, and handed my company to my brother. 1 minute to midnight, Gerald Sears announced proudly. 1 minute before the future officially begins. 140 guests applauded. Champagne towers glowing gold beneath ballroom lights. A 12-piece jazz band playing softly near the terrace. And my brother Colton standing beside my father like he'd personally built the SEC contacted me 93 days after the first submission. Not a phone call. Not a dramatic knock at the door. Just a secure message inside the whistleblower portal at 6:14 a.m. Interesting, honestly. Because the beginning of corporate collapse usually looks incredibly boring externally. The message read: Preliminary review completed. Additional documentation requested. That was it. No emotion. No alarm. Just bureaucracy quietly opening its mouth wider. I stared at the screen while my coffee cooled beside me. Nathan walked into the kitchen wearing sweatpants and carrying the morning paper. They responded? I nodded once. They want executive-level evidence. Interesting phrase. Because numbers prove fraud happened. But executive knowledge proves leadership chose it. Nathan sat across from me carefully. You think Gerald knows? I laughed softly at that. Not happy. Tired. My father doesn't let people reorder printer paper without approval. Pause. He knows. The problem wasn't suspicion anymore. The problem was proof. Because proving my father knowingly protected fraud meant detonating the last emotional bridge between us permanently. And honestly? A small part of me still wanted to be wrong. That's the terrible thing about family betrayal. Even intelligent people keep hoping for innocence long after evidence disappears. At work. The performance continued. Quarterly meetings. Vendor reviews. Board updates. And Colton behaving more like royalty every week. He started arriving late consistently. 10:30. 11 sometimes. Expensive coffee in hand. Talking loudly about vision. Interesting thing about incompetent executives. They always describe leadership like a personality trait instead of work. Meanwhile, my department stayed until 9 balancing actual numbers. Payroll. Tax exposure. Compliance filings. The invisible machinery keeping 230 employees alive financially. One Thursday morning. Pam entered my office carrying a routing slip. Colton's division needs approval. I took the paperwork automatically. Then froze. Vendor. Greystone Logistics Solutions. Amount: $890,000. Consulting services. 6 months. Interesting, honestly. Because fraudulent people always grow bolder once nobody stops them early. Under company policy, any vendor contract above $500,000 required VP Finance authorization. Meaning me. Meaning my signature would approve my brother's shell company payment directly. Pam noticed my expression immediately. You okay? Fine. Interesting lie. Because my heartbeat suddenly sounded loud enough to shake the office walls. I signed it anyway. That part matters. People always ask later. Why didn't you refuse? Because refusal without formal cause would have triggered internal review before the SEC finished building the case. Because fraud investigations require patterns. And because sometimes doing your job correctly exposes corruption more effectively than rebellion does. I scanned the signed authorization that night. Uploaded it to the SEC portal at 11:42 p.m. Fresh evidence. Current fraud. Active scheme. Then Nathan found me sitting alone at the dining room table staring at the confirmation screen. You did the right thing, he said quietly. Interesting, honestly. Because moral decisions rarely feel moral while making them. They usually feel lonely. August arrived brutally humid. And Gerald invited me to lunch unexpectedly. That should have worried me immediately. My father never scheduled emotional conversations voluntarily. Steakhouse downtown. Private booth. Bourbon before noon. All terrible signs. Gerald loosened his tie halfway through the meal. Then finally sighed. I know this transition has been difficult for you. Interesting opening sentence. Because narcissistic parents always frame your exclusion as your emotional problem first. I cut into my steak slowly. Transition? He ignored the tone. Colton needs room to lead. Pause. A company can't survive divided authority. Interesting. Because apparently divided authority meant the competent daughter existing visibly near the incompetent son. You mean accountability? Gerald's jaw tightened immediately. No. Pause. I mean legacy. There it was. The real religion inside my family. Not ethics. Not performance. Bloodline. My father leaned back in the booth carefully. You were always exceptional, Evelyn. Interesting, honestly. Because praise from men like Gerald usually arrives immediately before betrayal. But Colton carries the family forward. I looked at him for several seconds. The man who taught me financial discipline. Work ethic. Precision. Then spent 20 years handing emotional inheritance to someone else purely because he shared the correct gender. Do you know what your biggest mistake was? I asked quietly. Gerald frowned. What? You assumed competence transfers through last names. Silence. Huge silence. Not angry yet. Confused. Because powerful fathers rarely expect daughters to speak plainly. He paid the bill without finishing lunch. That's how I knew the conversation bothered him. Gerald Sears always finished expensive meals. 3 weeks later. I found the email. The email. The one that changed suspicion into certainty permanently. Gerald was in New York for investor meetings. Office nearly empty. Rain against the windows. 7:08 p.m. I stood inside his office holding the brass filing cabinet key in my palm. Interesting object, honestly. Tiny thing. Massive consequences. The key lived behind a box of monogrammed pens inside Gerald's desk drawer. Same hiding place for 15 years. Because arrogant men eventually mistake routine for security. I opened the cabinet slowly. Folders. Vendor files. Board correspondence. And one folder labeled CS Vendor Review. CS. Colton Sears. Inside. 4 printed emails. I recognized Gerald's private executive address immediately. Subject line. Greystone/handle quietly. My hands actually went numb reading the first message. Colton wrote. Dave says the Q3 wire needs processing by Friday. Gerald replied 23 minutes later. I reviewed the arrangement. The numbers work. Pause. Keep the invoicing below reporting thresholds. Another pause. I'll handle the board questions. Interesting thing about betrayal. Sometimes one sentence reorganizes your entire childhood retroactively. Because suddenly, every promotion Colton received, every excuse, every quiet dismissal of my work, every speech about legacy, collapsed into one horrifying realization. My father didn't accidentally protect incompetence. He intentionally built fraud around it. I photographed every page carefully. Front. Back. Metadata timestamps visible. Then returned everything exactly where I found it. Folder aligned. Cabinet locked. Key behind the pens. Same position. Same angle. I walked out of the office shaking. Not from fear. Grief. Huge difference. Nathan was waiting at the kitchen table when I got home. I handed him my phone silently. He read the emails once. Then again slower. Finally. He sat back in his chair and exhaled hard through his nose. This is conspiracy. Interesting hearing someone else say it aloud. Because internally, I still kept calling it family dysfunction emotionally. But Nathan understood what federal investigators would see immediately. Structured fraud. Executive concealment. Intentional reporting manipulation. Public company exposure. Gerald's email transformed the entire case. Not negligence anymore. Not poor oversight. Participation. And honestly, that was the exact moment I stopped trying to save my father emotionally. After that, I focused on protecting the company instead. 230 employees. Retirement accounts. Payroll. People with mortgages depending on numbers being real. That mattered more now. September became preparation. The SEC investigation officially entered enforcement review. Claire, my outside attorney, explained what that meant during a late-night call. They're building timeline structure now. What do they still need? Timing. Interesting answer. Because fraud cases aren't just about evidence. They're about proving when leadership knew something. Claire continued carefully. If your father publicly transfers authority to Colton after receiving internal warning signs. Pause. It strengthens the appearance of deliberate concealment. And suddenly, I understood exactly what the New Year's Eve party really was. Not celebration. Narrative control. Gerald wanted witnesses for the succession. Public legitimacy. Champagne. Photographs. Headlines. The symbolic coronation before consequences arrived privately. Interesting honestly. Because wealthy families often believe presentation itself creates truth. The invitation arrived in early December. Heavy cream cardstock. Gold trim. Black tie requested. A special announcement at midnight. I stared at the invitation standing alone in my kitchen. Then my mother called 20 minutes later. Did you receive it? Yes. You'll come? Pause. This is important to your father. Interesting thing about my mother. She spent 30 years translating Gerald's emotional demands into softer language. I'll be there. Good. Then softly. Almost automatically. Don't make this harder than it has to be. There it was again. The phrase. The family commandment. Shrink quietly. Smile politely. Endure invisibly. I looked down at the invitation still resting on the counter. Then answered calmly. It's already hard, Mom. Silence afterward. Long silence. Because deep down, I think she finally understood something irreversible was already moving beneath the surface. The next 2 weeks became strategy. I built the final SEC submission personally. 42 pages. Every Greystone transaction. Every shell company registration. Every wire transfer. Every signature. Gerald's email. Colton's approvals. Timeline fully cross-referenced. Clean. Precise. Devastating. I uploaded everything into the SEC portal as a draft. Saved. Waiting. One gray button remained at the bottom of the screen. Approve and submit. Interesting honestly. Because 14 months of silence eventually condensed into 2 words and 1 thumb press. Nathan found me staring at the screen around midnight one evening. When? He asked softly. I looked at the draft submission. Then at the invitation sitting beside my laptop. Midnight, I answered. New Year's Eve. Nathan nodded once. No hesitation. No speeches. Just trust. And honestly? That quiet trust mattered more to me than every applause-filled ballroom my father ever stood inside. New Year's Eve arrived wrapped in gold. Gold candles. Gold champagne towers. Gold satin table runners stretching across the ballroom like wealth trying too hard to look timeless. Interesting thing about rich families. They decorate celebrations the way monarchies stage succession ceremonies. The Blackstone Grand Hotel overlooked downtown Chicago. 32nd floor ballroom. Floor-to-ceiling windows glowing above frozen city lights. 142 guests. Board members. Investors. Local business press. 3 aldermen. And somewhere beneath the jazz music and polished speeches, a federal enforcement submission waited quietly on my laptop at home. Unsent. Not yet. Timing mattered. That's the thing about public collapse, honestly. Narrative control survives right until the precise moment it doesn't. Nathan adjusted my necklace inside the hotel elevator at 8:11 p.m. Simple black dress. Diamond earrings my grandmother left me before Gerald turned inheritance into competition emotionally. You okay? Nathan asked softly. Interesting question. Because people assume courage feels powerful internally. Usually, it just feels exhausting. I think so. The elevator doors opened. Applause somewhere inside the ballroom. Laughter. Crystal glasses clinking beneath chandeliers worth more than most people's yearly salaries. And honestly, walking into that room felt less like attending a party and more like entering a crime scene still pretending to be elegant. Gerald stood near the stage holding court immediately. Navy tuxedo. Silver cufflinks. The posture of a man who believed control was hereditary. Then there was Colton. Already drunk by 8:30. Interesting. Because incompetent heirs usually mistake celebration for proof they earned something. He spotted me across the ballroom and lifted his whiskey glass dramatically. Evelyn. Too loud. Always too loud. Guests turned automatically. Attention followed him everywhere because Gerald trained people to orbit his son emotionally. Colton wrapped one arm around my shoulder as I approached. Big night, he grinned. Interesting, honestly. Because he genuinely believed this was victory. Not exposure waiting politely behind midnight. You nervous? He asked. Nervous about what? The future. There it was again. Future. Legacy. Succession. Interesting how wealthy men always describe inheritance like destiny instead of preference. I think the future's already moving, I answered carefully. Colton laughed without understanding the sentence. Of course he didn't. Gerald approached seconds later. His expression warmed immediately for the cameras nearby. Always cameras. Always performance. Family together, he announced proudly to no one specifically. Interesting statement. Because some families only look united in professionally lit rooms. A photographer motioned us closer together near the stage backdrop. Gerald centered Colton beside him automatically. I stood slightly outside the frame. Same positioning as always. Interesting, honestly. Because emotional hierarchy eventually becomes muscle memory inside families. Flash. Another flash. Legacy preserved digitally moments before collapse. At 9:17, my phone vibrated once inside my clutch. Claire. One sentence. SEC enforcement team standing by. I stared at the message for several seconds. Then locked my phone calmly. Interesting thing about irreversible decisions. The world keeps sounding completely normal seconds before them. Jazz music continued. Servers carrying champagne trays floated between conversations. Someone near the bar argued about Bears football. Meanwhile, my father's empire quietly approached structural detonation. Mom found me near the terrace around 10. Champagne-colored gown. Pearl necklace. Carefully maintained sadness behind her eyes. She touched my arm gently. You've barely spoken to your father. Interesting observation. Because my mother still believed emotional distance caused the problem instead of fraud. What would you like me to say? That you're proud of your brother. There it was. Not honesty. Not accountability. Performance maintenance. I looked through the ballroom windows toward the frozen city lights below. Then quietly asked. Are you? Mom hesitated. Tiny hesitation. Massive meaning. Interesting honestly. Because silence becomes confession eventually in families like mine. Before she could answer, Colton climbed onto the stage holding a microphone. Already flushed from whiskey. 10 minutes till midnight, he shouted. Applause exploded automatically. Interesting thing about public charisma. People confuse volume with leadership constantly. Gerald joined him moments later. The jazz band faded quieter. Spotlights brightened. Cameras repositioned near the stage. Everything carefully choreographed. And honestly, I suddenly realized my father planned this announcement exactly the way kings announce heirs in old movies. Gerald raised a champagne glass. 1 minute to midnight, he declared proudly. 1 minute before the future officially begins. Guests applauded again. Colton smiled beside him like inherited power physically tasted good. Then Gerald continued. For 40 years, Sears Capital Manufacturing has represented family leadership. Pause. And tonight I'm proud to formally announce Colton Sears as incoming CEO. Thunderous applause. Board members standing. Investors smiling. Phones recording. Interesting honestly. Because everyone in that room believed they were witnessing succession. Not evidence preservation. Gerald extended his arm toward Colton dramatically. My son represents the future of this company. There it was. The sentence. The one I knew he'd choose. Not most qualified. Not most experienced. My son. Interesting thing about sexism in wealthy families. It sounds most confident right before consequences arrive. Colton took the microphone grinning. I promised to build on my father's vision. Vision. Interesting word from a man who approved fake invoices while drunk at noon. Then came the countdown. 10. 9. 8. The ballroom joined together loudly. 7. 6. 5. Nathan found my hand beneath the table. 4. 3. My phone rested inside my clutch already unlocked. SEC submission open. Approve and submit glowing blue at the bottom of the screen. 2. 1. Midnight. Cheers exploded. Champagne spraying. Music crashing louder. Confetti cannons firing gold across the ballroom ceiling. And underneath the tablecloth. I pressed submit. Interesting honestly. Because entire empires sometimes collapse through one quiet thumb movement nobody notices initially. Confirmation screen appeared instantly. Submission received. Timestamp. 12 o'clock and 14 seconds a.m. Federal enforcement officially activated. Gerald hugged Colton on stage while cameras flashed wildly. Legacy. Succession. Performance. And somewhere in Washington, their fraud case just became prosecutable. I should have felt triumphant. Honestly, I mostly felt grief. Huge grief. Because watching your father celebrate the son who helped destroy his company feels less satisfying than people imagine. Then my phone rang. Unknown number. Interesting timing. I stepped toward the terrace quietly while guests still celebrated behind me. Ms. Sears? Yes. This is Special Agent Marcus Hale with SEC Enforcement. Straight to business. No theatrics. Professionals never sound dramatic during history. We received the final submission. Pause. Federal warrants were authorized earlier this evening contingent upon executive confirmation evidence. Executive confirmation evidence. Meaning Gerald's public succession speech. Meaning the party itself just finalized intent. Agent Hale continued calmly. Our teams are now coordinating with the Department of Justice. I looked through the ballroom glass walls toward Gerald laughing beside Colton beneath falling confetti. Then quietly asked. How long? Tiny pause. Minutes. Interesting thing about consequences. They travel silently right until doors open. At 12:11 a.m., the ballroom entrance changed. Subtle at first. Conversations slowing. Heads turning. Music faltering awkwardly near the stage. Then 6 federal agents entered beside hotel security. Dark suits. Credentials visible. Purpose unmistakable. Interesting honestly. Because powerful men always believe public spaces belong to them. Until another authority walks inside. Colton stopped smiling first. Tiny shift. Massive meaning. Gerald followed his line of sight toward the entrance. And for the first time in my entire life, I watched certainty leave my father's face completely. Agent Hale approached the stage calmly. No shouting. No spectacle. Just documentation walking toward denial in polished shoes. Gerald Sears? The ballroom became silent instantly. Complete silence. The kind that permanently divides before and after. Yes? Agent Hale opened a leather credential wallet carefully. Federal investigators need to speak with you regarding securities fraud, conspiracy, wire manipulation, and falsified reporting activity connected to Sears Capital Manufacturing. Gasps exploded across the ballroom. Champagne glasses lowering. Phones rising. Board members backing away instinctively like proximity itself suddenly became dangerous. Interesting thing about corporate loyalty. It evaporates faster than champagne bubbles once federal language enters a room. Colton looked toward Gerald immediately. Panic now. Real panic. Dad? Dad. Interesting honestly. Because suddenly the future CEO sounded exactly like a frightened little boy again. Gerald recovered fast. Too fast. This is some kind of misunderstanding. Of course. Because narcissistic men always believe confidence itself can reverse evidence. Agent Hale remained perfectly calm. We have documented vendor routing schemes connected to Greystone Logistics Solutions. Pause. Along with executive communications indicating intentional concealment. Gerald's face changed instantly after that. Not confusion. Recognition. Because he knew exactly which emails they found. Then Colton made the mistake that destroyed him publicly. He looked directly at Gerald and whispered. You said those messages were deleted. Interesting thing about guilty people. Panic turns private conspiracy into public testimony unbelievably fast. The entire ballroom heard it. Every investor. Every reporter. Every board member. Silence afterward felt physically heavy. And honestly? That was the exact moment Sears Capital stopped being a company and became a federal case. Nobody touched the champagne after that. Interesting honestly. Because luxury dies incredibly fast once federal agents enter the ballroom. The jazz band stopped playing first. Mid-song. Saxophone fading awkwardly into silence near the terrace. Then came the whispers. Board members huddling beside marble columns. Investors checking phones frantically. Reporters already typing headlines before anyone officially confirmed anything. And Gerald Sears? The man who spent 40 years controlling every room he entered. Stood frozen beneath gold confetti while federal agents waited calmly beside him. Interesting thing about powerful men. They always look shocked when authority finally speaks louder than money. Colton unraveled immediately. That's impossible, he snapped. Voice cracking. They can't just walk in here. Interesting response. Because guilty people rarely deny the crime first. They deny the interruption. Agent Hale remained perfectly composed. We have warrants for electronic records, executive communications, and financial documentation tied to Sears Capital Manufacturing. Pause. You are instructed not to destroy or alter any corporate materials. Corporate materials. Interesting phrase for the lies my family built an empire around. Gerald finally found his voice again. This accusation is absurd. But honestly? The room already stopped believing him. That's the thing about public collapse. Confidence only works while people still assume competence exists underneath it. Once doubt enters the room, everything changes structurally. Alderman Ruiz quietly slipped toward the exit first. Then 2 investors followed. Then another board member. Interesting, honestly. Because loyalty in corporate spaces usually depends on distance from criminal liability. Mom stood near the ballroom stairs gripping her champagne glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. And honestly? She looked less surprised than exhausted. Like part of her knew this day existed years before it finally arrived publicly. Colton spotted me near the terrace then. That moment mattered. Because suddenly, through all the agents and cameras and collapsing reputation, he understood. His face changed instantly. Recognition. Then betrayal. You. One word. Heavy enough to silence the remaining conversations nearby. Interesting thing about scapegoated daughters. Families always act shocked when the invisible child finally becomes dangerous. Gerald turned toward me slowly. And honestly? I'll never forget his expression. Not rage initially. Hurt. Real hurt. Because narcissistic fathers often genuinely believe loyalty should survive abuse permanently. You did this? I looked directly at him. The man who trained me to understand financial systems better than anyone in the company. Then punished me for becoming competent enough to see through his son. No, I answered quietly. Pause. You did. Silence afterward. Huge silence. Because deep down, Gerald Sears knew the statement was true. Agent Hale stepped between us slightly. Professional instinct. But Gerald never raised his voice. Interesting, honestly. Because powerful men become quietest the moment they realize the performance ended permanently. What exactly did you give them? He asked. Not. Why? Not. How could you? Just evidence assessment immediately. I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny. Because even at the end, my father still approached emotional devastation like a business audit. Everything, I answered. That word landed harder than shouting ever could. Everything. Emails. Wire transfers. Vendor structures. False reporting. Board concealment. Every invisible decision they thought family silence would protect forever. Colton lunged verbally before physically. You ruined us. Interesting accusation. Because people benefiting from corruption always describe accountability as destruction instead of consequence. I looked toward the ballroom windows. Chicago glowing beneath snowfall outside. Then calmly answered. No. Pause. You ruined the company when you started stealing from it. That ended the argument emotionally. Not because Colton accepted it. Because the room did. Board members stopped avoiding eye contact after that. They looked at Gerald differently now. Not visionary. Liability. Huge difference. Agent Hale requested Gerald and Colton surrender their phones voluntarily. Gerald complied immediately. Colton hesitated. Interesting, honestly. Because incompetent men always believe hesitation changes evidence somehow. Colton, Gerald said quietly. That tone surprised me most. Not commanding. Defeated. My brother finally handed over the phone. And honestly? Watching them surrender those devices felt strangely intimate. Like witnessing two men physically hand over the lies they built their identities around. The ballroom emptied quickly after that. Champagne abandoned. Half-eaten desserts untouched beside linen napkins. Confetti still drifting across polished floors while investors escaped through side exits avoiding cameras. Interesting thing about scandal. Celebration decorations become crime scene props unbelievably fast. Mom approached me near the elevators around 1:03 a.m. Pearl necklace trembling slightly against her throat. For a second? She just stared at me. 34 years of silence sitting between us. Then quietly asked. Was any of this avoidable? Interesting question. Because enablers always ask about endings instead of origins. I thought about it honestly. All the years. All the warnings. All the meetings where Gerald praised Colton's instincts while dismissing my actual work. Then answered truthfully. Yes. Pause. When Dad chose ego over accountability. Mom closed her eyes briefly after that. And honestly? I think it was the first fully honest conversation we ever had. Federal raids hit Sears Capitol offices before sunrise. Servers seized. Accounting records frozen. Trading halted by opening bell Monday morning. Business channels ran Gerald's ballroom footage non-stop for 48 hours. 1 minute before the future officially begins. Interesting quote selection. Because irony becomes journalism's favorite weapon eventually. The board removed Gerald and Colton unanimously. Public statement issued Tuesday afternoon. Breach of fiduciary responsibility. Interesting corporate language honestly. Because billion-dollar scandals always get summarized with phrases designed to sound cleaner than reality. Reality? They stole. They lied. And they assumed the daughter handling the numbers would stay quiet forever. The SEC case expanded quickly after that. Additional shell vendors uncovered. Stock manipulation review opened. 3 executives accepted immunity deals within 2 weeks. Funny how fast loyalty disappears once prison becomes mathematically possible. Nathan found me sitting alone in our kitchen 3 nights later watching snowfall through the windows. You okay? Interesting question. Because exposing corruption doesn't magically remove grief afterward. Honestly? Part of me still wanted my father to have chosen differently. That's the terrible thing about family betrayal. You mourn the person they could have been almost as much as the damage they caused. I don't know, I admitted quietly. Nathan sat beside me without speaking. Just presence. No speeches. No advice. And honestly? That quiet support healed more than victory ever could. 6 months later. Sears Capitol survived. Smaller. Damaged. But alive. 230 employees kept their jobs. Retirement funds protected. Payroll stabilized. The company finally operated like an actual business instead of a family monarchy wearing corporate branding. The board asked me to step in as interim CEO temporarily. Interesting, honestly. Because the daughter denied leadership her entire life, became the only person capable of saving the company once truth mattered more than legacy. I accepted for one reason only. The employees. Not Gerald. Not Colton. Not the Sears name. Just the people whose lives depended on honest numbers. The last time I saw my father, he stood outside the federal courthouse wearing a charcoal overcoat and looking suddenly much older than 72. Snow falling lightly across the courthouse steps. Reporters shouting questions behind barricades. And honestly, he looked smaller without power around him. Interesting thing about narcissistic men. Authority often functions like scaffolding for their identity. Without it, they collapse inward. Gerald looked at me for a long time. Then quietly asked, "Was I really that unfair to you?" That question nearly destroyed me emotionally. Because after everything, after the fraud, after the lies, after sacrificing an entire company to protect his son's incompetence, part of him still genuinely didn't understand. I thought about answering carefully. Then decided honesty mattered more than comfort finally. "You taught me how to build everything," I said softly. Pause. "You just never believed I deserved to own it." Gerald looked away immediately after that. And honestly, I think that was the first time my father truly saw me clearly. Not as the difficult daughter. Not as competition. Not as betrayal. Just the child he underestimated for 30 years. The ballroom chandelier from the Blackstone Grand still appears in financial news footage sometimes. Gold confetti drifting behind federal agents. Champagne glasses frozen halfway to mouths. My father standing beside the son he tried to crown king moments before the empire collapsed. People online call it dramatic. Poetic. Corporate karma. Maybe. But honestly, I think the story is simpler than that. Companies fail the exact same way families do. One person becomes untouchable. Another becomes invisible. And eventually, truth stops asking permission to enter the room.